And that has big implications, of course, for how you communicate as a researcher to somebody who is a policymaker. Firstly, it changes how you design the original piece of work that you do. You don't start with a nice and interesting looking database and see what interesting things you can find in it. You start by asking, what is the policy lever that the policymaker might pull? What is their choice? And then what are all the things that bear on that choice? Secondly, you have to invest massively in communications. Annabelle makes it look really easy, but for the rest of us, taking something complex and turning it into something which communicates to someone who doesn't know the area so well actually requires a huge amount of time. And my observation would be very few people from academia invest anything like the amount of time that's required to do it. And then here's the third implication for researchers. If you are serious about this and having your research picked up by policymakers, because you have to attack the questions in a different way, and because you have to communicate in a different way, you will write less referee to journal articles. Because those first two things consume a lot of time, and as someone who's kind of always interested in trade-offs, is going to do more of that. By definition, you will do less of something else, and chances are less will be referee journal articles. Now, whether that's good for your professional development, I leave it to you to judge, but that's the trade-off.
Who are you influencing? Is it us at the end of the day? Is it the department? Or is it the public? Well, I think that's the problem with a lot of this debate is who is the audience of your research? And again, is it to publish? Is it for your own sake? Is it for the groups that you advocate on? And I think we'll get to the split between researcher and advocacy body and the various ways, particularly during the Howard government. Sorry, I can't help being political. When was childcare ever a female issue? So some of the language we use in these little things always drives me nuts. So we need to be careful about that. You need to be advocators, you need to be sellers, you need to have good language. But who are you influencing? So the husband came back with some really good articles, actually came back with too many as usual. So Nicholas Gruen, who, as I'm not really in this space, if anybody knows, I thought this was the best quote. Of course we want government activities to be evidence-based. And yes, there really are lots of ways in which government could take advantage of big data, but that's the TED talk.
I had a definition of evidence, one which was sort of hard and one which was much softer around signs and indications of things. And I think we should have a discussion about what we mean by evidence and what we think is good enough evidence, and whether we're all sort of on the same journey in terms of where we'd like to get for evidence in this field. So that would be one thing. The second thing is sort of relates to what other people on the panel have said. I also talked about what I thought was the importance of the idea of evidence-based practice switching to practice-based evidence. And that means you get closer to the coalface of practitioners, is what I was talking about. But it also means there are other audiences that are important. And if we have to be, as researchers, very strategic about who our audiences are, and they can be multiple. They can be based in the experience of practitioners, but they can also be based in the political forces of the day, where policymakers will make decisions and they will want to be properly informed by that. And I think researchers are not trained in that. We don't think about that. A strategic approach to what we can build with research platforms that are able to respond to questions in a timely way. I think researchers could do a much better job, and I tried to give you some examples of some of the things that we're doing with administrative data, and Nick Gruen talks about big data. So there are opportunities there, but I would say the problem for researchers is the drivers in our system, the incentives, are not to do that kind of research, as you pointed out, publishing academic articles and getting grants. And until the drivers in the system say, well, actually, there's another audience here. This is not about I have 300 publications. I've done some things that are considered mundane by my colleagues, and actually 12,000 people have looked at that, but I get rewarded for the others. So I think there are some things that we can do to make this much, much more policy and practice relevant. And I think it speaks to the way we're trained. So I'd like to see us explore some of those issues if we could.
What does count as evidence? Look, in a perfect world, of course, you are faced with policy decision A. You either have A or B, and you pull out the randomised controlled trial that shows that A gives you better results on every dimension than B. Now, needless to say, that is not what the real world looks like. Invariably, as I said, you get hit with a policy choice, and it's an all things considered policy choice, and you have to take evidence from all sorts of different sources and relating to different parts of that question, some of which will be magnificent rolled gold Institute of Family Studies randomised controlled trials. Some of them will be drawing on the literature from all over the world. Some of them will just be going to look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics and find out what does it say about X. Now, I would note that there are any number of questions where we don't do that. So one of my favourite ones is we've done some work on age at which you should get access to the pension. We always get told, but you know what? If people work for longer, then they won't volunteer, because all of those over 65s, that's the kind of core of the Australian volunteer army. Now, if I had $1 for Grattan Institute every time that I had been told that, we would be employing about 250 people. And yet, lying in plain sight, took us about half an hour, go and have a quick look at the census, at the ABS survey on volunteering, and you discover that for people over the age of 65, the volunteering rate for those who are working compared to those who are not working for a given age is almost exactly the same. There is no evidence whatsoever that working leads to, or not working, leads to people over the age of 65 volunteering more or less. Now, interestingly, as I said, that was a piece of work that took us a grand total of half an hour. It was not the world's most sophisticated piece of analysis, and yet people had been making assertions about that for a very long time. And I would suggest there are any number of questions in which we get assertions in the public domain where nobody bothers to look at the most basic of the statistics, and that's even in expert areas. And then the last thing that counts as evidence, in my book, is synthesis. And we tend to think of synthesis as being that kind of lower order thing that a Grattan Institute does, where academics do all of the kind of really hard, intellectually difficult work of the primary research. All I can say is we do plenty of our own primary research, and my experience is synthesis is the hard part. How does all of this come together? How do I tell a coherent story? How do I show that I have balanced all of the things against each other in an appropriate way? That's really intellectually hard. And that too, in my book, counts as evidence. Because if you're the policymaker, the key piece of evidence, if you like, is not what are all of the bits. The key question is, how do I put them together in a way which is intellectually coherent?
So there are 30,000 randomised controlled trials published in the health and medical literature every year. That's 100 a day. And that's why we have a synthesis industry. It's called meta-analysis, and we have huge factories that turn this stuff out. You know, they crank the handle on such and such a... And they're extremely important. But I would say, and I did a bit of this morning, not all evidence syntheses are created equal. Because in the fields that we're concerned with, I can tell the story, it works really well, no, it actually hurts, or there's no effect, just by cherry picking out different studies and synthesising that. So I can get a coherent story for yes, no, or it's actually worse by what I choose to synthesise. So I agree with you that true synthesis, which we call systematic reviews, are enormously time-consuming and hard work, and they have to be done. But they're really hard to do. And again, the evidence, the drivers for us as academics, if we're counting off the publications, we just completed one that take us over 2 years to do. One. But it would be really important
a lot of people have been talking about policy-driven evidence rather than evidence-based policy making. And this is absolutely the way the real world works, absolutely. But the question for a lot of us is, well, how can we improve the quality of what's available, the best available evidence for those who actually do wish to have a proper consideration of what works, of what the history is, of what the managers and professionals think, what the clients think, what public opinion says, all these other kinds of factors. But it's unrealistic to expect an individual academic to put all this together. That's why I think groups like the Grattan Institute are enormously valuable, filling in a very important niche, and it's a new niche. I mean, think tanks have been around for a long time, but the kind of business model that is being run by John Daly and his colleagues is quite distinctive, and I think is making a big difference. Groups like the Australian Institute of Family Studies are not so much in the advocacy business, but providing a highly trusted, integrated platform for others to work through really important topics.
When I think about it, it's sometimes if you've got the evidence but it's not at all pragmatic in terms of the operating environment in which you're going to apply that evidence. And I guess I'm often struck by the fact that many parts of our service systems, and certainly the ones I've always worked in, have been subject to enormous demand pressure and less than ideal operating circumstances in which you're going to be implementing the outcomes of the research or the program, designing programs, and how rarely that's taken into account. So if you think about the out-of-home care systems that are run across Australia at the moment and internationally, and you think a lot of the evidence comes forward about what makes for successful outcomes and what works and is good practice in terms of out-of-home care, and they don't acknowledge the fact that a horrendous number of children in out-of-home care have multiple placements, and what is the impact of 7, 8, 10, 20 different placements on the application of that evidence in that pragmatic operating environment. And so for me, it's that they're not always grounded in the reality of the pressures of the service systems in which you're going to be implementing the findings. And that's for me why the dialogue between the policymakers and the researchers is so important, that there is a good understanding of, yes, this is what you found from your research and all the analysis, but what would you guide the policy and program people to do in implementing that in the realities of the real world, in the pragmatic realities of the operating environments that most of us find day to day in terms of the work we do. And I think that's, for me, that communication. It's much easier to sell those messages then to the public, to the politicians, to those that you're working with, if the academics and the policy and program people come together and reflect that operating environment and then guide what is the best judgment call you make about what this means, about the best way going forward.
So you've done some research, you've got some issues, you've come to lobby me. So has 15 other 100 people. So what is our first order priority? So a whole lot of people used to come and see me, obviously, about asylum seekers, come and see me about Indigenous issues, come and see me about local issues. How does my issue become the first order priority so someone will pay it attention? And I can't answer that. I couldn't answer that while I was there. I can't answer it for you now, but I will disagree with John. Everybody should be interested in superannuation. That should be generally something we all actually get our heads around. So it's easy to sell something that is evidence-based and simple, plain packaging of cigarettes. Who's going to disagree with that? Well, actually, several people did. But the evidence was in. Climate change. Doing something about climate change. You would have thought tackling that issue would have been easy. In 2007, when we romped at home, everyone was all on board for doing something about climate change. Why? We're in the middle of a drought.
Even John Howard was by that stage.
Even John Howard was. We all went to that election. Everyone went to that election advocating an ETS. Malcolm Turnbull, most importantly, went to that election with Howard advocating an ETS. I would have thought the Liberals were more interested in a market-based mechanism than the Labor Party were. But that was based on sound policy. Find me, Nicholas Stern puts this out, find me
the actual scientist who is going to disprove climate change, they're getting the Nobel Prize. So there's your evidence. But how do you translate into policy? Because it's not just convincing me and you, it's convincing the voting public. So 2010 rocked around, drought had broke. Now it's a great big tax on everything. So it becomes, how do you manipulate it? How do you sell it? For me, it was always the Wayne Finch test. Wayne Finch was a fantastic guy who stood for the Labor Party in '98 when I first got elected in the seat of Flinders. He was a wharfie. He was running against Reith. Wayne wasn't the brightest bloke, but he was a seriously hard worker. So we had to send Wayne out there and he had to be able to explain to you what our policy was. But you had to have provided him with the information that made that easy. So it's not just having a go at anyone's intellect, it's the ability to translate all of this into action.
The question of language is really important. I think everyone's been talking about that. And being able to pass the barbecue test or the taxi driver test or the Wayne test.
Uber.
Yeah, the Uber test, whatever, is really important for people who want to communicate what I call evidence-informed policy ideas. So I think we're actually in the business of trying to move an understanding about social processes and what might work to help us improve them, moving that into the domain of decision-making and public debate. And we do have to have better stories or better narratives about what we're trying to do. But unfortunately, we have to sort of start at the front end about, well, what's the nature of the problem and why is this important and why is it urgent? And then make that whole string of arguments. But by that stage, you've lost the taxi driver. So you actually have to know at what point in that chain you're intervening with particular people. With some people, it's persuading them that the issue is even worth caring about. With other people, they're at the kind of, do we want to go down option A or option B? And then the evidence-informed arguments, I think, are extraordinarily powerful.
So can I just extend that? Because it seems to me there's another level that we need to think about. So I heard Fiona Stanley say once, and Fiona Stanley's one of the icons in our field, she said policy is easy. The implementation stuff is what's hard. And I think that's what Brian's getting at. There's another level of decision making here. We can have a policy. We've got lots of policies. I went through all these frameworks and things. We got stacks of them in this field. But the actual programs that get implemented can be consistent with those policies, but you've got 7 choices. So there's a whole other level of influence here that I think we need to think about, because when I see at the programmatic level decisions being made not by elected politicians, but by people further through the implementation process, they're making decisions all the time about whether 1 million goes over here and 3 goes over there. I don't want to overcomplicate it, but I think there is another process there that we need to think about in terms of how you get evidence actually into things that touch real people. The service delivery system. And that's where I was advocating for beginning with understanding the practice, the things that touch people's lives.
One is about prioritisation, and it is astonishing. I spent some time as a management consultant, so you spend your life worrying about prioritisation, and there's this whole literature about how corporates should prioritise. You actually go and look for the literature on how you should prioritise in the public sector. There is nothing there. There's just nothing. Apart from do whatever it is that is politically popular, which is kind of obvious but not that helpful when you're kind of thinking about a public servant being asked, so what, out of all of the things we could work on, what should I prioritise? And indeed one of the themes of some of the work we've been doing at Grattan is to try to say, how would you rationally prioritise in the public service? And as I said, one of the problems is there's just no literature even on what frameworks to use. The second thing that I observe is, obviously one of the things that does very much drive it in practice is, as Anna was saying, what you think you can ultimately get away with publicly. And again, one of the problems there is that the literature is remarkably absent, or rather, there's a really good literature, but it's kind of died as a matter of practice, in terms of the 2 key problems. Key problem number 1 is, how do I navigate through all of the political groups and political interest groups and all of the rest of it? otherwise known as political economy, a subject which is now pretty much not taught in our universities. It's become very, very unfashionable. And yet all the frameworks it sets up about how do you think about what gets up and what doesn't get up and how do you change that calculus work perfectly well. And then, of course, the second thing is how do I go about changing people's minds on stuff? What kind of arguments appeal, what kind of arguments don't? Again, there's a fantastic literature, much of it from BC, otherwise known as rhetoric, the theory of rhetoric. Again, by and large, now just not taught in our universities. A lovely piece that got written recently. When Shakespeare went to school, the dominant part of the curriculum was actually the teaching of rhetoric. How do you break up problems? How do you then communicate and argue for particular problems? And we've kind of lost that skill. And it's like political economy. It's something where we can actually teach it. And that, of course, leads to my third point, which is whatever the political economy, you should not assume that public opinion is a constant. Public opinion can and does change, and here's the key point, public opinion can be changed. So, to take a very obvious example, public opinion on gay marriage has clearly shifted massively over a 20-year period. Now, two things are necessary. One is you do have to have the advocacy, you do have to have the evidence that you are using that and all of the rhetorical techniques that go with that. And then the second thing is you do have to be patient. Public opinion on anything does not change in 3 months. Public opinion changes over a period of time, but it can be immensely powerful. And I think that you can, with evidence, change public opinion. It won't be fast, but if you communicate well, it can be very effective. And of course, it's infinitely more certain than changing a particular minister or public servant's mind. When the hearts and minds of the people change, the hearts and minds of our politicians follow very quickly thereafter.
It's terrifying, isn't it?
Certainly my experience has been sometimes people make assumptions about what the public think and what their appetite for reform is, and we haven't asked them. And so I think increasingly for me, and certainly my experience of this was around sentencing reform, we assumed that the public would always want tougher, harder sentences. And I remember this enormous pushback when we said, let's go and ask the public what they actually think. And they were, when we finally got it through and everyone was finally say, yes, let's maybe ask them, they were incredibly balanced and well informed when we gave them the opportunity to have the facts before them. And I think this is one of the things that I don't think we're doing enough of, is putting the facts before people, whether they are the public, whether they are the politicians, the policymakers and others, and then letting them mull over those facts for a while. And I think we'd be surprised more often how much sensible, informed advice comes back in terms of some ways forward.
I think there's actually quite a lot of literature, I hate to say this, but there's actually quite a lot of literature about reputational damage that is done to some scientists when they step across the corridor and become advocates for a particular point of view. They do tend to become, from one point of view, tainted or typecast or pilloried as ideological or belonging to some partisan camp or another, and that is a danger which individual scientists or researchers and practitioners need to face up to and make their own decisions. I think there's a lot of examples of policy entrepreneurs coming from the research sector who go out there with a favoured program and are extraordinarily good at getting into ministerial offices and saying, here's how to be a hero, here's how to change the way we do business in a particular area. I won't name names because that would be libelous, but we can all think of our favourite examples of that. The other way of thinking about it would be collective action. In other words, to use networks, to use groups that are set up to lobby around things. One of the most effective things that academics who want to remain anonymous rather than take massive risks is to be part of a value chain into other groups, like briefing NGOs or briefing people who work for a think tank, or having coffee with the backroom people in various government departments, so that there's a sort of a conveyor belt of good material, not raw data, not reports, but evidence-informed policy ideas that are practicable and help other people do their job better. So I think that's where it really needs to go. But most academics I talk to don't want to be advocates. They think it's far too risky. And as I think John here said earlier, the incentives in the university system are really running in the opposite direction. They're starting to change because the research impact agenda is about to burst on the university sector, and that will allow the universities to engage in some kind of cultural change where writing solely for top quality journals will not be the only thing you're judged on.
I guess the catch cry at the moment is co-design. And I guess this is what I think is the pragmatic reality, is that there's this growing push to say we want more people in the tent and we want them to be sharing the pain of designing some of these things together so that they come up with the best solutions in terms of way of taking forward some of the more difficult challenges that we have and are facing. And I think that goes to the heart of this issue. How willing will the researchers be to be involved in that co-design? Because you don't want to, I mean, my plea would be that they work a way where they reconcile their ethics and their integrity in the way that they preserve their academic excellence and still contribute to that, because if they don't, others will come on board who are often less informed about that and be far more influential in terms of that co-design, because I think we've moved on. The place of policy now is no longer in control of any one sector, definitely no longer in the control of the public service alone. And so you have this growing demand that the recipients of service, the beneficiaries of the policy, the general public, as we talked about earlier, academics and the policy and program operators have to come together and design what they think are the features of the best system. And I think that's going to be quite confronting for many academics about how they embrace that. But I suspect that horse has bolted. It's now seen to be the way we can overcome some of the deficits of our past silo-based approach to informing these issues, and I think it's going to be a very confronting issue for some, but that will have to be found a way forward.
Can I make two comments about academia and how I see it shifting, because I think it is shifting. The first is clearly there are more incentives than there used to be. I mean, I look at some of the material, for example, published on The Conversation by academics, and I'm certainly not going to name names here, but there are some articles there which I look at and I think that is not evidence-based. There is absolutely no way that would be going out under a Grattan label, let alone, or should be going out under an academic label. So I think actually the key problem is not so much academics being unprepared to do it. I think it's about understanding that even when you are in the public domain, you are still obliged to be genuinely evidence-based. And of course, the other key thing you have to bring is that inherently sceptical turn of mind that says, I might be wrong. If the evidence changes, then my view will change as well. Or indeed, if my understanding of the evidence changes, my view will change as well. So I think if you are going to participate in this kind of public debate, bringing that is essential. The second thing I observe is I think the academic world is changing quite fundamentally. If you look at the US, the top flight US universities are clearly way more engaged in public debate than here. Now, why is that? Lots of reasons to speculate, but I would suggest a key one is this. The dominant source for their funding is fundamentally their alumni. Their alumni give them money because they think the university is doing good stuff.
I get sent truckloads of stuff. The beginning of most of our days as members of parliament is delete, 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 chuck in the bin, chuck in the bin, chuck in the bin. You send me all your reports, you send me anything. I'm not going to have time. But I am going to have time to meet with my constituents, especially in a seat as marginal as mine was, and I am going to have time to build relationships with groups. I've worked hard in certain areas, anaphylaxis and anorexia, so the people in those groups knew to establish a relationship with me. I would then go and influence. I think that personal is still important. Technology is great, but deliver me from email.
I use the example of road safety as what I think is the best example of integrated policy development, where we've tried to address an issue where it was a partnership between police, TAC, which is a long-tail insurance agency, Monash University Centre for Action for research, and Vic Roads about road design. And they brought all these different perspectives together, and together they tackled how we're going to address the road toll and bring down the road toll in this state, so that Victoria became a leader in terms of road safety around the world. And it was a partnership between those unusual players who came together and said, what do we each contribute from our perspective about the science and the evidence behind how to reduce the road toll. They've stayed on message now, and it's been nearly 20 years plus that they worked on that, or even longer when I think about it, when we first introduced seatbelts. And they brought into play a whole lot of dimensions that came together and changed a system that improved a result and an outcome for our community. And I think for me, that contribution of somewhere like Good Shepherd or whoever else is involved in this is so important to us, thinking about what each part of a service system can do to help drive outcomes and improvements for our community.
And what's the magic?
I share your optimism in terms of the capacity of that public sector, because I think that policy capability is the strength. It's been the core skill of what you've had in terms, if separate to service delivery. So when we talk about what you might do in the sort of agencies that you've been working in, and I do think that they are incredibly gifted at that. But it is this issue now of, I think, the flexibility of who you work with and how you can engage with those other partners in this timely way. Because sadly, I have been known to be responsible for things like drafting legislation over a weekend. So there are some of those issues where it's the speed at which you have to work. And I think that's, for me, the increasing pressure is how the public servants still do what they're incredibly good at, but they may no longer have a year to do that policy piece that's going to inform the thinking of the minister or the government, but where they have to really be good at networking and getting that evidence together and really trying to gather it quickly so they can write the good policy position, give the good, frank and fearless advice to the government and inform them about what the pros and cons are. And I guess that touches on, for me, about that the public servants will be really helped if there's a better means by which you can keep up to date with where the research is at and going. And I use it, and I have to declare my interest here with IPA, but nonetheless, if I think about the role of a publication like the Mandarin, which is just this broadcast that comes out, hits my inbox and a whole lot of others, and catches my attention on a regular basis with articles I can look at, and then go and back up and have a look at the further detailed explanation for it. It's fantastically powerful for public servants to keep abreast of developments. There's nothing in that about where the academic research, if you were to say how often is there an article that's informed by where is the latest research, or what is the equivalent of that that's been provided to policymakers about where they might easily access new and emerging thinking and information. And I think that's something that's going to be really critical to keep these issues at the forefront, so that the policymakers can turn around what they need to do with the speed at which they do, and capture the knowledge and information that's there about what's in those drawers or what's in those recent publications, and it's very accessible.
Although, interestingly, the conversation is starting to fulfil exactly that function. I mean, I know that we've worked with public servants who say, oh yes, I know that you've done that because I read your piece on such and such, and then I took the links to go back to the original work. So there are certainly, I think the conversation in particular is starting to act in that way for at least some departments.
I'm really optimistic as well, and I think you need to find some researchers who are nimble and willing to engage that way, and they're there, and they need to have, I wasn't sure it was a back door or a backyard or...
The back book.
The back book, sorry.
Bottom drawer.
Who've got a back book. I think that's a really important concept. Keep that back book, and people can respond quickly. That allows the quick response. And there are researchers out there like that and create those relationships.
Just add one thing. We did a survey of senior public servants a few years ago and asked them what was their preferred mode of interaction with research-savvy people. And they clearly said, like Anna says, we don't want the bloody fat reports. We don't have time. We can't even be bothered sending them down the ranks to get someone to do a brief to tell me what was in it. What they actually want is people who know stuff that's research informed who have some policy literacy to engage in effect, confidential conversations like forums, think tanks, in-house things, secondments, problem solving under conditions of confidentiality, where people can toss around ideas and get a direct line into tapping into areas of expertise. I think they found that enormously valuable as an idea, and the limitation was that the Minister's office often didn't like it. So I think there's a kind of a permission piece here. There's how do we create the spaces in the public service where people can have robust conversations about a small number, priority issues which need to be worked through from a number of different points of view. And to me, that's part of quality assurance for people like you to be able to do your job better.
So there's a couple of things there. On one hand, I think the tools we have to measure the outcomes we're interested in are really blunt. And that's a huge problem that we face in these fields. We're really blunt instrumentation. So you're right, we don't find things on these very blunt measures sometimes. So yes, programs, and I don't want to single out HIPPY, it's true for all of the things that I talked about this morning. On one hand, I agree with you, and that if that's enough, then that's okay. That yes, people like it, it works for them, it must be doing good. Fair enough, but let's just have that. Let's not say, oh, well, it's based on 14 randomised control trials that actually don't show anything. On the other hand, it's the one-handed economist thing, isn't it? On the other hand, I think it would be hard to suggest we should be spending public money on something that we know is not generating the outcome that we want it to. And I don't want to be too much either way, and I think your point is very valid. But I think we'd be dissatisfied if we had a program that everybody enjoyed that didn't achieve its goals. I think that's hard to argue for as a public spend.
And I think that's the elephant in the room. It's the money. As I was talking about priorities, it's not just priorities of what's interesting or what's public debate, is how do we fund all this? What do we fund? What don't we fund? The thing as a Member of Parliament you always found really hard is someone arrives with their desperately ill child and they want to get a life-saving drug on the PBS. This life-saving drug will probably cost $1 million per year for this child. It won't save them, it may give them 3 years of more life. There's 8 kids in the country with this disease. I'm citing an excellent example. Do I say to that mother, which I did and she has never forgiven me, I hate to tell you, but the PBS is not just about the drug, it's about the economic outcome. There's no economic benefit for that amount of money to 8 children with a crippling disease. That's hard. That's cruel, and when you've got the little kids sitting in front of you, it's unforgivable. But that's the reality that we also deal with. So what are you dealing with is we ain't got enough money. That's one thing we can probably all agree on, and both sides of politics will agree on. So where do you spend that money? Some of the most effective lobbyists are in the health space around drugs. The Rare Cancer Group, they're great. They put on a really good cocktail party. Every time one of you turn up and put on a cocktail party, I get a bit suspicious. Why isn't your money going somewhere else? Thanks for the cocktail party. The ABC does a great one. They do the best.
Not anymore.
No, it's been going downhill for a couple of years, the ABC one. But again, here is a group of individuals who are suffering from cancers that are incredibly rare. The medical research might come in about how to help or prolong or do, but there's no clear evidence about that, and it is for this finite group of individuals versus what you might be able to do in the cardiovascular space for an enormous group of individuals, what you might be able to do in the dementia space. So that at the end of the day also is what bears on the ultimate policymaker. The cabinet is mine. What is the economic outcome as well as that feel-good outcome?
Yeah.
I think that we've said before that it's important to find ways of connecting up and collaborating and networking to join up various forms of knowledge, but not for its own sake, but to my mind it's around priority issues that have been identified as worthy of collaboration and worthy of exchange of information and so forth. So purposeful collaboration, purposeful networks, I think is part of the solution. I think individuals necessarily feel quite isolated, so trying to institutionalise some things is important. There's quite a few new organisations that have been set up in the last 10, 15 years to try and make this intermediary space work better. I mentioned, for example, in Sydney, the Sachs Institute, which does public health work, which is connecting up New South Wales Health Department with the research community to do quick evidence-based reviews on particular topics, where the agenda is being set by the government funders of the service. And that's one kind of model that I think is quite useful in both directions. But unless we have some sense of what are the priority areas that we should pay attention to, then I think the collaborative space looks a bit empty.
I'll just give one example. We're building what John talked about as a back book in South Australia in partnership with the government. That's taken a long time to do that, and I funded that with $4 or $5 million of competitive funding. But we're building a collaborative platform that works for both sides, and we're able to be using that platform in a fairly nimble way, and that uses the administrative data that's already collected throughout the system. We've already paid for it once, but it tends not to be well used by government. And I think that's an example of something that could really foster, make this process much, much easier, as you point out, of co-design. It would make that much easier to have happen.
I guess it's really interesting because we do say we operate in a world of open government. I mean, it's meant to be that there's this commitment to open government, but it's not really. And I guess I think that for me, some of our most wicked problems are driving us to have more collaborative sharing and more openness, because there's not an answer sitting in one part of a sector or a department or an agency. Family violence, I think, is the case in point, where there's now much more transparency about how that issue is being dealt with. And when others were thinking before, I was thinking, I think that a contemporary challenge that needs to drive us to think about how can we engage more is about countering violent extremism and what we're doing with young people who are disaffected, and how do we share our knowledge and information about that. Now, anything that's got a security overlay, there's even more in terms of that desire not to share. But I think that we are being driven to say we'll share more information the harder the problem gets for any one part of government or one sector to solve the problem. And I'm optimistic that that will drive a change in attitude about the sharing of information, because I think the reality is that technology will enable it, and I don't think our publics will tolerate us saying we didn't share it to try and explore some of these tough issues. And I think we see that now whenever there's an adverse event and it gets finger pointing about who in government knew or anticipated this and didn't share that information. And I think that change and the robustness of our media and other processes, I think, will help to move us to act on that commitment that open government is good government, and to be less scared about sharing some of that information.
Here, John?
Yeah, I mean, two things I'd observe. One is we are seeing an opening up of government-based data sources one way or another. It's obviously something that Malcolm Turnbull, assuming he gets re-elected, is personally very committed to, and I think it does make a difference.
That leads nicely onto mine, because I'm both pessimistic and optimistic about the future. Optimistic because there is the technology and the individuals who have it, and sharing the information is becoming more and more important. Most of the funding now is all based on collaboration as well, which I think is a good thing, because it does actually force people in their silos to look outside their silos and do that. And people want the information, they're clamouring for it. You can go online, you can get it, you can have it, so long as you do then verify what you've read in Wikipedia is actually the truth. As I recently said to my 14-year-old son who wondered why his teacher said, "I don't think this is all accurate," in his last essay. So, it is out there, and we are dealing with people who are far more capable of using that technology, sharing and questioning. So much of what we are given, we give it as politicians, as academics, but we don't get to interact with it. So I think now we've got a society, sadly it is probably via Twitter and Facebook, but are actually interacting with that information. The negative, the pessimism, is the flip side, where people want to fight back against that. Pauline Hanson may get 2 people up into the Queensland Senate. We've just had Brexit. So there is also a whole lot of people out there going, no, too much overload. I want to stick in my little garden shed and have my prejudices echoed out there by people in that public space who will give us the commissioner for the wind turbine, even though every bit of research says there is no health risk from any wind turbine out there. We are funding that commissioner versus direct action in climate change. So there are 2 competing things out there, and it is really up to all of you in this room to fight for the side that has the evidence to win against the ones who actually don't want it.
2 quick points about data. Having data and knowing how to use it are different things. And if this is all the data that's out there, here's the bit that you need here to answer the question. But you've got to know what the question is, and that's why you have to have co-design. The second point is I was in a Cabinet Committee meeting in the South Australian Parliament. This was the Cabinet Committee on Child Protection. It had the Attorney General, the Minister for Health, the Minister for Education, the Minister for Community Services, as well as the CEs of those organisations. And we were showing them some information around child protection that was based on a co-design and using a back book. And the Minister for Education said, facts are our friends. We need to do more with this information. And I think that is a major change that's there. And that's why we ought to be optimistic about the ability to do better, I think.